Welcome. I'm Andreea Gleeson, CEO of TuneCore and U.S. Ambassador for Key Change. I want to welcome you to today's fireside chat, where we will be reviewing the results of Be the Change Women in Music 2022, which is a groundbreaking study on the underrepresentation of women and gender minorities in the music industry. I'm coming to you from New York in our Dumbo, Brooklyn office. We're back in the office, and there is jackhammering going on outside. So in true New York fashion, we have a little extra texture to the sound. If you hear that, that's what's going on. So thanks for bearing with me. Number one, I just want to say thank you for taking the time out of your busy day to review the findings of this study with us. And I'd like to really kick it off here by welcoming our incredible panelists who will each introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Hannah Callert. I'm one of the analysts from MIDiA Research. I'm one of the 3 authors of the study that we're going to be discussing today. So yeah, very excited to be here talking about it. Thanks, Andreea.
Hey, good afternoon from Paris, France. I'm Denis Ladegaillerie. I'm the founder and CEO of Believe, and I'm very excited to be with Andreea and Mark and all of you this afternoon on such an important topic as women in music, and one that has been very close to the central topics at Believe since the creation.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Mulligan. I'm the lead music analyst here at MIDiA Research. Really excited to have been involved in this project for the second year, and I hope you're going to sort of find the results as we walk through them really interesting. Just want to say one thing before we get going. Some of you might have noticed when we sent out the initial invite for this webinar that before we'd had the full lineup, there were 2 men and 1 woman on a Women in Music panel, and you know, obviously, you know, that sort of raised a few eyebrows. The great irony was, obviously, is that this project has just been so much just led by women, done by women. You know, that didn't reflect at all the way that we've approached this. But there is a really important reason that we've got 2 men on this panel, and that is the challenges and the problems that women face are not caused by women; they're caused by men. So you know, if men have to be a part of the solution, whether they're allies or obstacles, change won't happen without them. So that's why you've got myself and Denis here to not to get in the way of the key findings, not to dilute the the really important message that the all-women team in this report have delivered, but instead to tell you what role we think men should be doing to help make things better.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I will attest to the fact that the MIDiA team has some incredible women that have been working on this study with us. So there's been about 4 of them and a couple coming in and out as guests, and it's been just incredible. We've been working with them predominantly with Mark and Keith. They are supporting and providing that additional layer, but really the work has been by incredible women in the MIDiA team that's really done the big lift on this research. So 100%. And I guess before I hand it over to Hannah to really review the overview on the findings and the insights, I did want to give a little bit of background on how the study came to be. As some of you may know, I actually don't originally come from the music industry. Before I joined TuneCore 6 years ago, I worked in retail and e-commerce, where I spent over a decade bringing shopping online. And for those of you that may be familiar with the retail industry, women are just at all levels of the organization. So it was very striking to me when I came over to the music industry and saw that that was not the case, both on the executive side and for creators. I remember in my very first month of joining TuneCore, and you spend your time learning the business, and looked at who made up the artist base for TuneCore. And it was very striking to me that only a fourth of TuneCore's self-releasing creators were women. This is especially noteworthy because, as many of you know, TuneCore is an open platform. There are no gatekeepers. There's no barrier to entry other than if you have $10 to get your music up on the stream platforms, you can. So this never really sat well with me. And it's something that stuck with me for a long time. And then fast forward to the summer of 2020, when I started reporting to Denis, Believe is actually TuneCore's parent company. And I sat down with Denis, he gave me my OKRs. And the number one objective on my OKRs was to work on gender parity, both internally and externally. So I took that goal and ran with it. And as any person who is going to begin an initiative, you start with data to inform what is your plan going to be, so that you know where to start. And when I started looking around at all the studies that were out there, there were many studies that talked about what the diversity gap was between men, women, and other underrepresented groups in the music industry, but none of them provided the insights into the why. So that's when we engaged with MIDiA to find the underlying reasons and help us identify areas of opportunity to bridge that gap. And we started with women creators last year. And there were three really overarching findings from last year's study around what drove the disparity. One was with something more obvious, so harassment and sexualization, to something more subtle, like access to resources and opportunities, and then even invisible, like confidence and unconscious bias. So this year, when we went to build on the findings from last year's study, we wanted to expand it a little more. And we worked with other organizations across the music industry to help us think through what are those additional dimensions we want to add to build. So we added additional questions around women executives, men and other gender minorities to the survey and the kind of questions that we asked. We also expanded the study to be more to include more international countries. Predominantly, the respondents last year were from the US and the UK, so we really wanted to expand that global footprint, we will review later. So the survey respondents went from about 400 to over 1,000. So without further ado, I want to pass it on to Hannah, who is going to review the highlights from the study and with the results and the insights.
Thank you. Yeah, well, so we've been elbow deep in getting this all designed and published. So I hope I don't go too fast. But if in the event that I do, just download the study. It's all in there. We've put a lot of work into making sure it's fabulous. So yeah, just a brief overview. As Andrea said, we tried to make it more global, a little bit more inclusive, 1,000+ respondents. We were less than half US and Canada, about 30% Europe, and about 22% rest of world. So obviously it's not entirely where we would want it to be truly global, but that's next year. But we were able to get out some really cool nuances from that information. So jumping right into the highlights on what's changed, because obviously we've had the opportunity to do a study last year, and now we've had the opportunity to do one again this year, and in between there's been a whole year worth of pandemic, which is obviously going to change everything. And so if we just look at a little bit some of the stuff that's improved, the good news, there's been a lot of the people we surveyed said that they saw greater visibility of women at music events and conferences, greater diversity of women in executive roles and positions of power. More neutrally, we saw continued sort of exclusion in technical areas like production, so things that are normally male-coded, quote unquote. Sexual harassment and objectification sort of stayed the same, which is rather unfortunate. And just generally a lot of stuff stayed the same. The only one that really got worse was criticism and abuse on social media platforms, which is largely attributable to the fact that a lot of the music creation in the last 2 years has been done on social media platforms. So, you know, it's not really the solution. It's just kind of a continuation of what's been going on. The only real caveat that we wanted to highlight about visibility and diversity is a lot of the women we surveyed also called out tokenism as a continuing problem. So diversity is diversity, but it needs to be also recognition of actual talent, and there needs to be more behind it. So that's something that the industry does really still need to work on. It's not, you know, a done deal. Moving on to the next slide, we sort of broke down the issues into main categories of perception, value, and harassment. We also had the confidence gap as well, which we go a bit more into in the study, as it's very important. Primarily, these are just things that, you know, the biggest issues that crop up. And the one I really want to highlight is perception, so the pressure to look good, which has a lot of knock-on effects on other issues. So it can limit who becomes successful, why, who gets signed. If you're forced to focus too much on appearance, a lot of our creators said it's very hard to focus on the actual art form. And it is a gateway to sexual harassment, which we actually delve into in the regional section. So as Andreea said, we managed to expand the study and get a little bit more nuance. Obviously, this isn't each of these topics that we delved into the nuance of is its own topic in and of itself, but we just wanted to really touch on them because obviously they're very important when talking about this topic. So on the next slide, we look a little bit at the regional basis there. So I've got two sets of slides in front of me. Yeah, so one of the most striking correlations we saw was that the US and Canada had the highest rates of, and I say highest rates versus like lowest rates, and they're all pretty like close, but like we're looking at deviations like of a little bit, just enough to prove trends. US and Canada had the highest rates of sexualization, reporting that that was something that they had to deal with on a regular basis. And then they also said that they experienced the highest rates of actual sexual harassment, which is really interesting. I mean, it seems kind of obvious when you think about it, but that's kind of what we found last year was we published these findings and a lot of people came out and a lot of the women were like, yeah, no duh. And a lot of the other people were like, whoa, these numbers are so high. So it's just one of those things to really point out, you know, like the more you make image and sexualization a product, the more that sort of opens the door to people acting on that. More interestingly, we actually saw in LATAM and rest of world, they were actually the least likely, despite experiencing a lot of the same issues, least likely to say that bias would limit, they expected that to limit their career progression. There could be a number of reasons for this, including that they're newer markets, but we did notice that one of the correlating factors was that a lot of them said they wanted to, or their definition of success was to gain 1 million+ streams, have a global audience. So they were very digital first and not really as focused on their local industries, which may not be the case so much in Europe and North America. So we also managed to delve into, on the next slide, some of the challenges for minorities beyond gender. This is always obviously a very difficult topic to delve into without really going into it, but we just wanted to touch on the fact that there's nuance to experience. So we asked, you know, like, do you have another minority status that might affect your experience of the industry? And while there was no single issue that really stood out for those who had another minority status, be that gender, religious, ethnic, or otherwise, they did over-index for frequently versus occasionally. So while the overall rates when combining the two were fairly similar to the overall group of women or all people surveyed, they were more likely to say frequently than to say occasionally. So it basically says that any instance of othering is likely to make their journey through this industry and their careers just that much more difficult, which is really something I think is important to highlight and think about when we're trying to make progress in this industry, is that there's nuance to experience and you can't just have one solution that fits everything. You have to take into account that there's so many different factors that go into this. We also, well, we then asked the question of men, what can you do? Or what are you doing? And we found some really interesting findings there. So if we move on to the next slide, we asked, what are you doing? And a couple of the solutions that women had proposed would be very helpful. And a lot of the men said that they were consciously listening. They were encouraging women to be part of the business. They were involving women in projects, and they were being cautious to respect women in their space, which are all great things. Love to see it. But what we did notice was sort of a perception bias or a perception gap, which was that they were less likely to notice, as Andreea said earlier, they're the obvious issues, sort of more subtle issues than the invisible issues. And men were very much less likely to report these more subtle or almost invisible issues, and very much less likely to report having acted on them. So Mark will talk a bit more about that in a second. I just have one more slide to cover, which is really the final findings. What are the priorities for moving forward? And they were really aligned. All of the women creators and executives alike were very aligned. We do go into those differences, by the way, throughout the report, but short on time here, so do read the whole thing. Basically, we asked what would encourage more women and other non-male gender identities to enter the music industry, and overwhelmingly they said mentoring and coaching opportunities, more representative role models, diverse ownership and management. So it's not about diversity for diversity's sake, as a lot of, I've been on panels before where people have said, oh, we can't have diversity for diversity's sake. It's all about like who's really good at the industry, and women are not asking for diversity's sake. They're asking for the opportunity to prove themselves, and they will take that. And one of the, I think we'll go into this a bit later as well, but we were able to interview a lot of younger creators who basically got their careers going during the pandemic, when they had so many of these new online tools to use. They were almost completely independent, and they were making their own ways in the industry, and they were finding opportunities that really spoke to them, and not really like going into situations that made them feel like they had to compromise their safety or their goals or what they wanted to do musically. So really it's about extending opportunities, recognizing backgrounds and education that may not be traditional. So there's a lot to that as well, but these were the main priorities here. So with that, I think I'm to hand you over to Mark, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about that previous slide about the perception gap, because it's actually very fascinating, and I think we have a lot to learn from that.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Hannah. So I think what you can see from this very sort of high-level summary of the findings, and as Hannah said, the report's free to download. Do absolutely go and have a look at it. For those of you who don't have the time to necessarily read the whole thing, we've got a executive summary as well this year, which sort of pulls out the sort of the most important points. But I think there's really sort of two ways to think about the results. Number one is there hasn't been that much change. Now, realistically, it's only 12 months. Not a huge amount happens in 12 months, except lots did happen in the world in 12 months. It was, it's a year like no others, as like all years seem to be these years in the world. We're certainly living in interesting times. But you think about how the pandemic resulted in people spending less time in the physical places. So whether that be in a studio, whether it be in the office, whether it be on the stage, that should mean that there should be fewer occasions in which things like harassment can happen, for example. Yet we saw no really meaningful change of that, which was a little bit depressing to say the least. But also, when we think about things like confidence, which is a hugely important theme here, and we'll come to it in the discussion in a moment, but the thing about confidence, in some ways, whether you're male or female, if you don't have a lot of confidence, and you're spending your time communicating via Zoom and email and whatever else it might be, then in some ways it's really hard to actually get yourself in a position where you feel like you can properly express yourself. So I think there's a lot of things which have, sort of been contributing factors to why some change hasn't happened as much as it did in the last year. The one thing which was very, very encouraging was, in addition to that big survey, which you've seen the results of, Hannah and the team also spent a lot of time doing interviews with women creators and engineers and executives, etc. One thing which we didn't necessarily expect to see, but was really clear, was the cohort of young women creators who really sort of started coming to the fore during the pandemic. So their entrance into the music business was like no other previous intake of women of creators. They were not playing small clubs and venues. They were sort of doing everything online, etc. They felt particularly empowered, and that was a really interesting thing. They were saying it was, what do you need? Just give me the opportunity and I will seize it and I'll make what I can of it. And I think that's, hopefully one of the things you'll see through this is the role that everybody in the industry, but men in particular, will need to do is just give people the opportunities, give them the space to thrive, and essentially get out of the way, but but give them the support. So we're going to do a little bit Q&A. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the sections of the report, which are looking at the improvements, looking at the state of harassment, the confidence gap, the role of gender minorities, and then finally looking at the the perception gap, for what men think versus what is the actual situation. What I recommend you do is we've got a comments field here in the app, so do drop your questions in there, and we'll sort of put those together for some open Q&A at the end. So let's start off with improvements. I think overall the study did show that not a huge amount of change in 1 year. There's some bright spots. You've got 40% of women creators thinking that visibility's got better. 36 saying there's an improvement of women in executive positions, but things like women in places, creative places like studios, etc. Only about a quarter of them thought things had got better. So let's start with the positive side of it. Andreea, over the course of the last year, from your perspective, what have you seen as being sort of the big and most important positive changes that have happened?
Yeah, I feel like it felt like every week we were getting announcements in the news about women being promoted. It was very exciting. I feel like I saw more women be promoted to top leadership positions in the last year than I saw in multiple years combined, which was very exciting. And then organizations started to make really meaningful updates to their programming. So a couple examples, this is not exhaustive, but Chartmetrics, for example, launched their Make Music Equal, which is a database that features self-defined pronouns and gender data. Native Instruments did a community drive, which provided a free sound pack and encouraged donations and awareness to Girls Make Beats. As you know, producers are the most underrepresented group for women in the music industry. So they're doing a lot of work there. Spotify, it feels like it's been around longer, but Equal only launched last year. So that was very big. And most recently, for those of you going to Music Biz next week, I had some time over the weekend to go through the programming, and I was struck by just how many keynotes, panels, workshops that there were each day that were focused around education about diversity and gender equality, as well as providing those resources and opportunities to those underrepresented groups. So it is like making a very noticeable update, which is good. It's like the good first step.
Perfect. Good. Okay, Hannah, I want to come back to the thing about tokenism that you raised. With 37% of women creators saying they frequently witness tokenism. What should we do with that?
Be wary. I mean, essentially what it implies is that some of the improvements we're seeing in women who are visible in the public eye, obviously we like, or role models are good because they give young people, something to aim for, that they can visualize themselves in that position, and so that's great. But some of these improvements can be an appearance of diversity and visibility rather than an actual recognition of hard work and talent, which is obviously the most important thing. It's a creative industry, and hard work and talent are, all the artists we spoke to basically said it's how good a job you do that keeps you in the room. And that's something that really resounded with all of their, it was amazing to speak to them. They all have such determination, such incredible stories, and really inspirational. Some of these Gen Z kids are insane, they're crazy good. So it's really not enough to create token opportunities for women in predefined limited roles, like you can be promoted or you can be signed, but only if you fit this little mold. There's a need to promote them and compensate them equally, and just treat them as equals and give them a diversity and a greater number of paths to success that isn't just fitting one role that forces them to compete against each other and sort of sacrifice their integrity as creatives and as people who are good at what they do.
Yeah, so I think and obviously we'll come on a bit more about executives in a moment, but looking at the role of women creators, one of the things we identified last year in the work, that essentially most of what we were seeing was the wider marketplace in microcosm, right? There's just, you know, so many of the things that happen in other industries and other walks of life were happening within, you know, within the music business, within music women creators. But there are also some unique dynamics within the music business, and particularly within independent creators, that essentially amplify some of this stuff. So there are more people making music than ever before. There are more people releasing music through platforms like TuneCore than ever before. So that's an incredibly positive thing, that there are so many more people out there making music. But it also means any artist, any creator, whether you're male or female or gender minority, it's difficult to cut through. So that makes it doubly important that women creators feel like they have the opportunities, that they're given a fair chance to, you know, to succeed, because it's like, it's doubly hard for them to succeed as new emerging music creators than it would be in many, you know, many other walks of life. I've got another question for you, Hannah. So look, we've spoken, moving on to the harassment section, we've spoken a bit about how the pandemic has been this sort of like, you know, disruptive force, but also one that has created some, you know, sort of new opportunities, you know, new ways of working, etc. It's made, for example, you don't need to be in a studio as a sole woman creator at 2 o'clock in the morning with a room full of men and not feel particularly comfortable or able to express yourself creatively to the full extent, etc., with more sort of online collaboration tools, etc. But I'm just wondering, from, you know, from both the interviews and the you know, the results of the survey, how would you say, what are the main ways that the pandemic has both disrupted the music business but also created new opportunities for women?
Sure. I mean, well, obviously it disrupted the music business, but for young creators, sorry, my cat is not being helpful. Obviously it affected the broader industry, but for those younger creators or people who were just thinking of trying it out, suddenly they had time and the tools to do it, and they could do it from home, and they didn't have to worry about going into a studio, what the atmosphere would be, you know, walking into an unknown in a physical way. So they turned to the internet, a lot of them, you know, to YouTube, to teach themselves new skills. We talked to a producer in I think it was Nigeria, who basically just said, you know, it was too much of a faff to go in and deal with these men who were all producers, and so she just taught herself, and now she's, you know, she's doing great with that. It working online in general, for some of them, for the younger ones, they said it removed a lot of the elements that they'd heard were issues in the music industry prior to them joining. And yet sexualization does remain the root of many problems for women, 57% of whom reported no change over the last year. So obviously it is still a bit of an issue, but you know, and nearly 40% were compensating for this by saying, oh, well, sorry, 40% of creators agreed that some women were consciously deciding to make music at home rather than the studio because of this. The caution here, and this was something that we really learned when talking to some of these younger creators, because it's very easy to then say that working remotely is a solution, right? Like, oh, well, if sexual harassment is the problem, then everyone work from home and work on your computers, and then you never have to deal with sexual harassment again. That's not the case, because these younger creators, all their big career goals were to go live. They wanted to fly across the world and meet their teams. Even some of the more experienced creators we were talking to were saying, one of them, basically, she worked as a producer as well as a performance artist, and she said she didn't like performing because of the lens, the focus, the pushback. But she said, you know, she would not want to go working fully remotely, because working with a team, working in real life is part of what making music is about. And so basically what we can kind of draw from this is that remote working and online working, and what the pandemic has sort of enabled us all to learn how to do, is a tool that these women are using, that independent artists, you know, regardless of gender and regardless of what they might be facing, are using, but it's not the solution, because it does come with, you know, social media pushback and harassment on social media and all this other stuff. So there's still a bigger problem at play, but it's actually been really cool to see that the pandemic has given women the tools to build their own careers, and they've been doing it. So it's kind of inspiring.
Mark, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Two things I'd add to that. So number one is clearly the solution to women trying to, not have to deal with harassment, etc., should not be them taking themselves away from it. It should be solving the environment, in which that happens in the first place, rather than making them have to sort of, change their behaviors as a consequence. But that said, the change in music production technologies, which we really, has been accelerating over this last couple of years and is changing, at an accelerating rate. There are elements of the music business which is going to take a huge amount of time to essentially, sort of lose its absolute male dominance. So studio engineers and mixing and mastering experts, etc., incredibly male dominated, much more so than, most other of the segments of the music business. So when there are tools and services online which, women can use, so they can, if they want to make that choice, be able to do that without having to be in a room with a man. It just means that there's more choice and more opportunity for them to, plot their own path. Conscious we've got a lot of ground to cover, but I want to talk a bit about the role of confidence. And Andreea, you sort of, the study showed that, sort of even, executives, women executives struggle with confidence issues and ideas of like the imposter syndrome, etc. So could you just talk a little bit about why is this the case? Why are so many women feeling like they've got imposter syndrome, particularly when you said there's loads of promotions happening, there's progress that we can see. Why is that?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things here. Number one, if you're in an environment where you feel harassment, you're experiencing that your value and the perception gap, that there's a gap there, it's going to affect your confidence. It's going to second guess yourself. And so they're directly related. And one thing is also noteworthy is that often, I'll say this for myself, I feel like I need to tick all the boxes before I go for something. While what I've observed for my male counterparts is they will hit 3 of them and they'll just go for it. And often what happens is that women just don't apply for the job or submit for the showcase because they want to feel like they're overcompensating for feeling really ready for that step. I'll use an example. We have we're opening up a lot of tech roles. That's also male dominated. Music tech, it's really tough in our space. We've got a couple of dimensions, and very hard to get women to apply. We have to go to them and encourage them. And meanwhile, we get applications for engineers. Somebody has no coding experience that works at a pizza shop. It's just very interesting. There's kind of this behavior that women have around wanting to tick all the boxes before they go for it. So there's work that I think we need to make the environment more friendly to help women feel more confident. But then we also need women to also just take the shot and don't feel like you need to tick all the boxes.
Okay, perfect. So Denis, as a sort of male in a leadership position in the music business, what was noteworthy to you about what was shared in the study about women's confidence?
Well, I think it's as Andreea was saying. I think what is really interesting about the study is it shows a little bit of progress, but finally it shows the need of the cultural change, and confidence is one of these elements where I was reading in the survey 50% of women feel more comfortable expressing their ideas to other women or non-female members. Yet 2 women out of 5 still think that working with male in the music industry is likely to translate into higher success for them. And so there's still some of these perceptions that we need to change in the confidence. I think part of it's a number of things that we've touched on. I think it is more leadership at the top. It is more women, non-male gender across the music industry and creating a better environment. And it is also creating better coaching, better training for women at the time of music education, networking. It's in all of these areas that we need to work at the same time. And last I'd say there is surveys like the one that we are detailing now are absolutely critical there, because they are pointing the fingers around what needs to be changed. And we can now go back next year and say, hey, has it changed? How much has it changed? What do we need to do to make it change so that next year we have 10% more women that feel that they're more visible, that feel that they're more empowered, and that harassment or other topics are at lower level than they were before.
Perfect. Good. Okay. Thank you, Denis. So, Andreea, moving on to the section on gender minorities, as Hannah said in her presentation, the difference with gender minorities that they were not so much that they were more likely to experience sort of discrimination, but they were more likely to experience it more frequently. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, 100%. And I know that the sample was really small on this, and it's an area that I think as we look to next year, we'll expand on it further. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, what we saw was that across being dismissed due to gender or minority status, feeling their work is judged to a higher standard than male creators, being worried about being marginalized or safe at live events, and having experienced criticism or abuse on social media platforms, all of these areas, we saw they just ranked a little bit higher than the total group when you look at including women and some of the, just the larger group. So I think that what it shows us is that, the additional layer of untraditional differences can often single individuals out, making their career paths just that little bit extra more difficult. So very important that we take note of this. And, as much as we're doing all this work for women and it's good, we need to make sure we're also paying attention to the gender minorities.
Perfect. Okay. So moving on to the perception gap. So the perception gap is fundamentally this. There's a scale of the challenges that women face, and then there's what men think of the scale of the challenges that women face. And sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, men fundamentally do not perceive the problems and the challenges to be anything as significant as women experience it to be. So we've got this perception gap, even among those men who identify themselves as allies, who are, trying to create the space for change, creating the support, changing processes, changing their behavior, etc. And yet still, they don't see the challenges being as significant as women do. So, Denis, we hear a lot of talk about sort of allyship, and it's clearly it's a really important thing, but it's it also has a risk of not being enough. It's just like, yeah, I'm there to support you, particularly if men don't actually perceive just how significant the problems really are. And so a lot of men in the survey sort of lack the awareness of the full spectrum of women's challenges. So what are your views on this?
Well, I think this is the reason why, Mark, it is so important for you and I and other male to be on panels like this one. Because as you said it at the beginning, it is men allyship, I think, is a critical element in helping male understand these perception gaps, because of course you and I, we all perceive there's areas that are very obvious, the bias around, hey, looking good for women. Yes, there's obvious things where we know the perception plays. There's much less obvious ones when it comes to unbalanced parental or expectations, and things that are more subtle, where we need to have much more sensitivity around these topics, and carry the flag with changes either driven at corporate level or culturally in the discussions that we have with male teams and male leadership around organizations like ours.
Good.
You're
thank you.
Mute.
So, I mean, what I'd say from my personal experience, I think one of the things that is really important for men to do is as much as they can. We'll come to the calls to action in just a moment, but I think just one of the things beyond the sort of just the enforcement side of it, about sort of dealing with bad actors, etc. I think it's also just really important to understand what women need from you. You know, and it's like, it's again, this perception gap. You might think you know what they need, but there's a really good chance you don't really understand what they need. So that brings us neatly on to the calls to action. You know, what we want, there's a number of things we wanted to do differently with the report this year. And one of those was to take it from simply being a reflection of where we're at now and what the challenges are and how that's changed, and you know how it affects different women in different parts of the business and gender minorities. We also wanted to say, right, what do we do with this? You know, because fundamentally we were all a bit disappointed that not much had changed in any meaningful way from last year. So clearly, simply showing people how significant these challenges are is not enough in itself. Which is why what we've added into the report this year are some calls to action across all of the different categories we've been talking about. Really what every one of us can do, particularly the men. But even if you're not a man, you can go and try to encourage the men around you to pay attention to these things and play a role in trying to help, you know, sort of make these come to the fore. So I'm going to start just first off with you, Hannah. Just at a high level, what do you think are some of the things that everyone can do to try to sort of make sure that when we talk about this in a year's time, be the change has become the change?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, on the highest level of what's the best thing that you can do is one of the things that we did with this study, which I thought was really cool that you don't see in a lot of studies, was we went to women and we asked, what do you need to make a better industry? And you can do that in any walk of life. You can do that in your own company. You can do that in your personal life, and just, you know, turn to the women in your life and go, what can I do to make it better? And they will all have, you know, we've seen the importance of nuance. They will all have different things that meet their circumstances. And, you know, that's the most important thing you can do is to ask the question and to actually listen to the answer and to do something about it. But, you know, in general, just for, you want some highlights, some quick takeaways, as a music consumer, you can prioritize diversity balanced playlists and share them with your friends. You know, the numbers make everything. If something's popular, it is repeated. So if you can make sure that something diverse is popular, that's a good thing. Take the initiative to attend festivals, concert houses, venues that are committed to diversity, and encourage your friends and communities to do the same, or even encourage your favorite artists to go and perform at these venues rather than choosing something a bit better. You know, as a fan, you have that kind of power. We have that direct communication now on social media. So never think that you're powerless, even if it's just like, I choose to stream this today, or I'm going to share this, or I'm going to choose this venue over this venue. Those little impacts do make a difference. So yeah, be aware of your choices and ask questions and listen to the answers is my high level feedback.
Good answer, Hannah. Denis, what are some of the things that companies can do to counter harassment as well as the perception, value and confidence gaps?
I would say is set your priority right, set objectives and measure. And I think one of the things that Andreea said in introduction, which is when you set an objective, which is your number one OKR is gender equality, that tells something to your organization. And then you start measuring across. I'll give you very concrete examples. At the headquarters here for Believe, 6 years ago, we started measuring an index of gender equality. That index takes into account the number of women we have in the top executive teams, global number of women, equal pay, number of women that are being promoted each year versus men, number of incidents that we have. And we measure every year our progress towards the index. When we first measured the index 6 or 7 years ago, our score was 65 out of 100. This year in 2021, our score was 99. And every year we progressed. And why did we progress? Because we said, this is a really important company objectives. These are the things that we want to cover. We want equal pay. We want to create an environment where women feel encourage where they can develop, thrive, etc., at all level of the organizations. And when you do that, when you say, hey, this is so important that it's a priority, and now I'm going to measure how much progress I'm making towards my goal, then you can start having real meaningful change. And it doesn't take a year. It takes 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to take 10 years of continuing change and work to get to the point where we want to.
Perfect. Thank you. Right. So I mean, really encourage you to hear the progress has been made. And I think talking from the male perspective about some of the action items for men. Clearly, harassment is the most obvious need. Just harassment needs to not happen at all. And and that's why men in an organization, it doesn't matter whether you're in a leadership position or not. You look around at what happens around you. Every single man has got to have a zero tolerance for harassment. And harassment takes many forms. Some of it might be subtle, and some of it might be just use of language or whatever else. But all of it has to go, because it's like the I forget who it was now, but there was a mayor of New York who had the broken windows theory, which is like he didn't want there to be any broken windows anywhere, because if you had a broken window in a neighborhood, you get another broken window, then another, then there'd be graffiti, then there'd be more crime. And it's that's the same thing with harassment, is zero tolerance, so that it's absolutely clear that it should not happen. So if you're not in a position of leadership and you see a peer or even a superior saying something, doing something which is wrong, either have the confidence to call it out yourself, or take it to your line manager or whoever to go and get them to go and deal with it. So for those who are in a position of of management leadership in the music business, no, it has to be applied equally, this zero tolerance. One of the things when we saw through the whole Me Too movement, some of the worst actors in this were the people who use their positions of power. And that can happen when other people in positions of power are scared of, upsetting those people in power. You have to have the confidence to be able to go and do that. So sometimes it's even more important to go and deal with the people in power who are doing it, because they're sending a message that they have the right to do that. In the perception gap, I think it's really important, again, at whatever level you're at within an organization. And it's obviously a bit more difficult and a bit more fluid outside of the business and more in the music creative space, but it exists in all aspects, whether you're just in the studio, backstage, in the concert, or we're working in a record label, whatever it might be, is to understand that you as a male might have a very different perception about how your organization and your working environment is set up for women than it actually is. So continually ask, continually check, find out, listen more, accept that your view of how things are may well be somewhat distant from what is actually the view. And then on the value gap, I think there's this really important thing. Across loads of different industries, you have lots of studies showing about how the disparity in pay between men and women. And one of the reasons for that disparity, well, there's two underlying reasons, right? So one is, are people being paid at parity for levels of seniority? I mean, that just, that shouldn't even be a conversation anymore. People should just get paid on merit for what they've achieved, for the value that they bring, but the other level is just that you don't have as many women in businesses making themselves progressing up to more senior levels. And of course, the higher up in an organization, the more likely you are to get paid more. So if your organization is lopsided, then you are going to have, even if you're paying parity at different levels, you're still going to have a mismatch in terms of how women are remunerated on average versus men. So with that, I want to go into one last thing is for you, Andreea, to talk about, in terms of action points, what can be done in order to counter harassment? Give us some sort of pointers.
Yeah, there's a good expression that was all over the New York City subways that was like an ad campaign. It said, if you see something, say something. So don't let it slide off. Like, go to your HR department. If you feel you were being harassed, go to your support groups. If you're not in an organization, if you're a creator, go to those support groups and share it. And harassment can be very subtle. It could be as simple as you're the only woman at a table during a meeting, and they look to you to take the notes. And maybe in the moment it's not appropriate to address it, but don't let it slide. Like, go and have that conversation either with the individual directly or someone else that can have the conversation with the individual. Those, we can't let these things go. Some other things women could do around the perception gap. I think one of the most interesting insights that was from last year's study was around how women are aware of all these organizations, like She Said So, Color of Change, Hypertribe, Key Change, all these organizations that provide a support system, but they didn't join them. So join them. They will provide more access to resources and opportunities for you, and that support system that you need to help you grow. And then for the value gap, I think this is where women that are already in top executive positions need to be thinking about, how do you lift as you climb? And how are you supporting the team members under you that are in these underrepresented groups to make sure you're being helping them grow and giving them those resources and opportunities to keep progressing in their careers? And everybody on the executive side need to be supporting the creators. And then from the confidence gap, this is one I'm going to be a little direct on, and I'm talking to myself as well, which is number one, take the time to assess your own strengths and weaknesses. When you know yourself, you can better advocate for yourself. And this will then give you the opportunity to work on those things that will help you get better. So when the opportunity comes, you're ready. And then proactively seek out those resources to help you get there. And then this one, it's kind of a what do you call it, basketball analogy, which is you will miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I kind of mentioned this a little earlier. Don't second guess yourself. Apply for the job. Submit for the application for the showcase. Remember that you belong in this industry and own your space.
Perfect. Thank you, Andreea. So I think we've got maybe time for just one or two questions, but we've got, so do use the comments field to drop any questions if you've got them. I think we've got one which we're going to go to now, which is, so we've talked about our calls to action. Now let's think about how we can actually, right now, as soon as this webinar is finished, today, tomorrow, next week, what are the immediate steps which people can take? Bearing in mind that a lot of the calls to action we've spoken about are big changes that might take time. It's a process. It's, it's listening to people, working out how you make those changes, etc. But what should the first, every journey starts with the first step, right? So what should be the first step on that journey? I'll go to you first, Hannah.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I just, honestly, to reiterate, I think it's asking questions of people who will know the answers, and ask the woman around you, like, what can I do to make this better? I mean, you can do the reading, but it's easier to have a conversation. I think also it's important on both sides to, and for everyone really, to view this as a conversation and a learning experience. No one's ever going to get it 100% right the first time. Equally, there are always going to be people who say, men who say, oh, men can't do anything anymore. Like, no, like, you can, but if someone's saying that they're uncomfortable, there's a reason for that, and maybe you should ask them about it, learn from it, and apply it, and that's okay. Like, this is part of the process. So part of calling out behavior is learning how to educate people as well. So yeah, I think just talk to people is probably my biggest tip.
Good advice. Denis?
I would say if you manage an organization, start with balancing your leadership at the top level. Once you have top leadership that is balanced, female minority leadership, then that means that you have people at the very top who will be conscious about the cultural change that needs to take place, and that should in each of their organization drives the objectives to make sure that they get to better environments. So that would be my piece of advice.
Perfect. And finally, Andreea.
Yeah, I will give one that actually happened to me last year. So after we did this panel last year, I had an outpouring of outreach of peers across the industry that said, how can we work together? And that sparked initiatives that we did together. There was a gender equality hub we did at Reeperbahn together. We provided resources and opportunities for women at that conference that came from industry experts, male and female and non-binary. It was like a wonderful mix. And I really, really appreciate the males that have stretched out the hands. I'm going to give a shout out to Joel Andrews, president of CD Baby, who was my first outreach. And he and I started having monthly calls to talk about what we could do together. So, so definitely, no matter what role you're in, reach out to that peer to say, hey, how can we work together? Because what we do individually is one thing, but as we start putting the efforts together, we can actually accomplish more together.
Great. There's another question which I'm going to put to you, Denis, which is how can a woman combat her fear of calling out unacceptable behaviors, especially if this regards a man with high power? In an organization, how can you make a woman combat that fear? What can you do? What can she do?
So the way we've, I would say, it's the way you do it, the way we've done it at Believe is we have dedicated lines to people specifically on this. So if anything ever happens, there's a number you can call with dedicated resources that anonymously, I will not know about it. No one will know about it in the organization, but that will listen to you and understand what needs to take place. Because ultimately, especially if you have someone in high power, you need to create that trust. You need for people in your organizations to be able to speak, and that person, wherever he or she sits in the organization, is not going to feel that she should speak if at the end of the day the message comes back to the top of the organization. So that's why you need that line to go externally to someone that will be a trust person for the message to go out. To me, that is the only way of actually doing it.
I mean, that sounds like an incredibly powerful approach. Clearly, one of the problems for women creators is they don't benefit from having an organization with, systems like that, or even just like, one of the things we heard a couple of times from women creators is, the wider music industry does not have an HR department. And so I think, one of the ways, if you are, there's this double fear, right? Which is, if I speak out against somebody who's important, might be a producer, a writer, a booking agent, whatever it might be, is that going to damage my progress as a creator, as an artist? I think the only thing I could say there is, look at the people, women and men around you who you feel you can talk to about it, who you can trust to, and get their advice. People who might have experience with that person, and they might say, look, here's a way of working around it. Here's somebody who will be able to have some influence on that person, or might give you recommendations of other people you can work with. If it's your, somebody who your record label has put you into touch with, is, to work with on a record or whatever else, simply go to them and say, talk to somebody who you have a good relationship with that label and say, it's not working out. What is the best way for me to take that forward? So fundamentally, it's like feeling your way around with people who you can trust to get their advice and their pointers into, sort of how best to deal with it. It is, there's no getting away from it. It's a really difficult thing about not wanting to put at risk your career, but also not wanting to have to tolerate, that sort of behavior. So look, we're out of time now. It's been a really great conversation. Thanks for your questions, and I'm just going to hand over to Andreea, who's going to have a few closing comments.
Yes, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you so much for all the panelists. In closing, I just want to share one last story of encouragement to illustrate that change is possible. Over the last year, TuneCore implemented several key initiatives that were directly driven from the insights from last year's study. I think I mentioned that the percentage of women that were participating and using TuneCore at the time, at the end of 2020, was around 28%. I'm excited to share that at the end of 2021, that rose to 42%. The initiatives that we did and implemented range from small updates to longer-term commitments. Some examples of that: we signed the Key Change Pledge to publicly commit to gender equality. We partnered with organizations across different sectors of the music industry to provide those resources and opportunities to women and gender minorities. We also made sure that we were walking the walk and made sure that our company marketing materials equally represented both men and women. Additionally, I started speaking more publicly around the challenges to create awareness. And because of some of these updates that we did, it really kind of shows and illustrates that change is possible in providing an increased, creating increased participation of women. I want to thank all of the incredible organizations that partnered with us in making this study more robust this year. There were numerous ones. They are included in the study, and it's really because of all that collective brain power that we made this next version even more powerful. And I will leave you with this. I want to challenge all of us, both collectively together and individually, to accept our roles to be the change that we want to see in the music industry. So read the study, take on the calls to action. If each of us commits to change, we will be successful. So thank you so much for joining, and please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always looking for more networking partners. Thank you very much.